I am a strategy junkie. So the biggest piece of advice I have for people is know where you're going from day one, right? Like, it shouldn't be hard. You need to know where you're going. You need to have a vision of the world 10 years from now and why it's going to be different and what it's actually going to look like, and then work towards that vision. So at any point in time, it's never difficult for me to figure out where we need to go because I know where the world is going.
Welcome to Tools for Tech Leaders, a podcast for C-suite executives and tech decision makers who are excited to connect with peers and thought leaders, sharing ideas, frameworks, and tools that resonate and that are useful. I'm your host, Ian Tian, CEO and co-founder of Mattermost, and today we're thrilled to be joined by Shely Aronov. Shely is founder and CEO at InnerPlant, a biotech company developing crops that communicate specific early stresses like fungal pressure or nitrogen deficiency via easy-to-collect optical signals, creating a better farming system through a partner ecosystem fueled by plant data. Shely grew up in Israel, and she came to the U.S. to get her MBA at Stanford, where we met, and where she chose entrepreneurship as her focus. Inspired by some work her father-in-law was doing in biosensors, Shely saw an opportunity to create a lasting positive change in the world. Shely, it's such a pleasure to have you join us today.
It's great being here. Thanks, Ian.
I'd love to hear about your story. Like, you grew up in Israel to where you are today. Like, how did that happen? What was that journey like growing up?
Well, yeah, I grew up in Israel. I was in Israel until 26 years old. I think one of the experiences I talk about that influenced me is going to the army. So in Israel, the army is mandatory. And I guess this is an interesting tidbit, but I was in the army monitoring borders, and it was 2001. So that was, I would say, kind of the first experience of high intensity. We would monitor the borders at night. I had a team of 9 soldiers. And I was, 18, 19. So I think overall kind of a good experience of learning about leadership and what does it mean to lead versus manage, which is a very different concept in my mind. And then after that, I worked as a supply chain consultant for a few years, studied industrial engineering at Tel Aviv University, which kind of makes me an engineer, I suppose. I don't know. It's hard to say. And then I had my dad's dream was for me to go to business school in the US. So I joke, but it's not much of a joke. I didn't really know what I was getting into. I was doing the applications when I was 24, I think, because it takes a while, right? And I didn't know what Stanford was or California or any of it. All I knew is that the East Coast seemed bad for me, like people wearing suits. And I was like, this is not right. Like, I'm not going to, I come from this casual country. So ended up in Stanford. And I think that was definitely the right decision, just not one I made consciously. And then things started to get interesting. So when I knew I was going to Stanford, I kind of was getting bored from being a consultant in this small firm. And I had this opportunity from this woman I met in my building where I worked to lead a marine construction company. It was a project that was funded by the World Bank to build a water treatment system for the city of Cartagena, Colombia. And he was looking for someone to lead the project. The CEO is this crazy Israeli guy that won the bid because he went really low. And I was like, yeah, this sounds like a great idea. I'm going to go and do this. And went, and the project was like $30 million, managing 15 or 20 engineers and a team there. And a huge learning opportunity, and was a great experience to see that I love this stuff. Like, I don't know, and learn a lot of tidbits, but it's hard to remember what. And then I went to business school anyways. And after that, started a food brand. And did not like that. It was too small for my ambitions and not something that got me super excited. So that lasted for about 4.5 years. And then when I figured, okay, we can grow this slowly, but what's the point, was the moment that I decided, okay, I'm going to go do something really big. And that was the InnerPlant moment, which was already 6 years ago.
Yeah, that's amazing. And the InnerPlant story is awesome. I actually just had Nick Halla on a little while ago, who's on the board of InnerPlant, one of our classmates growing up in B school. I'd love for you to I'd love to learn more about the history of InnerPlant. How did it start, and what do y'all do?
What we do, if we start there, is we enable crops to tell us what they need, or really to signal when their immune system is activated to a stress in their environment. The goal really is, and this was from the early days, just being an outsider to ag, is we have a pretty remarkable food system, which means it's scaled, it's cost effective, and it feeds most of the world every year, right? With no fault. The issue we have, though, is we're not optimized on the field because we have no idea what plants need. So things are done on a schedule. We broadcast apply chemicals, 3 times a season for soybeans and herbicides, and 1 time in fungicide in a specific time of the season. And it's not really rocket science as much as we just don't know. It's incredibly hard to know what's going on in a small plot. So of course, not in a 5,000 acre field. And most of these stresses are invisible. You can't see fungus, and you definitely can't see a fungus infestation. So the idea was, can we enable plants to tell us what they need? And if we do that, then we can track what they need. And the nice thing about plants is they're actually super active in their environment. So this is like kind of some of the magical stories is people think plants are just hanging out there doing nothing. No, they are constantly communicating, protecting themselves. They're little manufacturing plants, right? And because they're immobile, they actually have very evolved mechanisms to protect themselves. Because unlike human and animals that just run away, these guys are just like, we got to do something, right? So they have a lot of these very efficient mechanisms to protect themselves that start super early on. And that gives you the opportunity, if you can catch it early on, to actually resolve problems and treat them in the right timing versus, after the fact when the damage is done, which is what happens in the status quo.
You went from, your food company was hummus, if I got that right?
Yeah.
So it's like, I've always been fascinated. So you're doing a food brand, it's hummus, it's delicious, and you're sort of building it, and you're like, now I'm going to create plants and bioengineering and satellite communications. It's like, it's a really great story. So just kind of curious, how did you go from this business to that business? You're like, I just want to do something that's incredibly hard.
Yeah. It wasn't like a linear, there wasn't strategy between the two. I remember when I started the food company, my confidence wasn't as high. And my story I told myself was, I'll just take a little bit of money and make it into more money. And that feels safe. And I don't think that ever matched my ambitions or what I want to do in life. So with the second company, or the second startup, I was like, look, I want to do something big. It doesn't actually matter how much money you raise, right? If the outcome is big, but I want something that matters, that fundamentally will make an impact. And that could be a standalone long-term company. That's key for me. And then around the same time, all of this happened really fast. My father-in-law, who was a professor at Tel Aviv University, retired since, he came to visit us. This was June 2017. And he's like, look, I figured out how to communicate with plants. And I thought, wow, this is super intuitive, because if plants just tell us what they need, what can we do with this thing? And I knew nothing about ag. And then I went and I spent 2 months at the university for the summer. Just convinced my husband to go with the kids. I don't know, we had one at the time. And I was spending a lot of time with this other professor who's a molecular biologist who just taught me everything about how you make transgenic plants that signal when they're stressed. And that's when things started to come together. So I went and I talked to farmers, and it's super intuitive for them. And that was a big selling point, is I would just go to people that farm whatever crops and ask them, hey, we have this technology and it lets your plants tell you what they need. Do you want that? They're like, yeah, the plants hold all the knowledge. We just needed a way to get it. And then I'd say, but it's genetically engineered. And they'd say, yeah, of course it is. Everything good in ag is genetically engineered. I'm like, okay, so this doesn't seem like a barrier. And that was kind of the beginning of it all. And then from there, I was meeting my co-founder, Rod Kumimoto, through an introduction actually to someone at Davis, who's an amazing molecular biologist. I'm obviously not a scientist. And then the whole journey was, what do the customers need? And what's the right strategy in order to infiltrate the industry and build a standalone business? And those two things in unison created everything about InnerPlant. So it has to be in the seeds. We have to go with a crop that is not completely consolidated. So soybeans versus corn. We have to see it from satellite. So we found a technology that we translate to satellite because nothing else will be cost effective enough. It needs to run seamlessly through the operating systems that the farmers use. So we need to work with John Deere. We need to work with the right partners so that it's easy. And every part of it was just thinking about it from the customer journey and what are they going to want to implement, what was successful in the past, and then go make that happen. Never leaving any gaps. Because I feel like every time you say, well, they can just, buy that one thing from that one person and put it on every time you do that, you're going to lose market share, right? And if you do that many enough times, you're going to end up with small adoption in the end of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Just thinking about how you think about the customer journey, the supply chain, the infrastructure you need, and where does that go? What's your vision for where? So my understanding of InnerPlant is that you've got plants that are modified so that when they're stressed, they can emit they can sort of fluoresce in a certain range that can actually be seen from space. So you've got these satellites that can notice in large fields what is under stress and where to sort of strategically put remedies and to help that crop. So where does that go? So that's where you are today. That's the business you're building. Where is that in sort of 3, 5, 10 years?
That's exactly the right description. And the first product concept is a soybean that signals fungal pressure. Where it goes is just continue to add more crops and more detections or more signals. And the idea is we kind of view this as the operating system for crops, right? So anything that has an economical threshold for farmers that has a treatment and that can move the needle on performance can be another signal. So if you take fungus, you can have above ground and below ground soil fungus. You can have insects chewing or sucking, different categories. Drought, if you have irrigation, that's another one. Nutrients, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus. So if you take away a lot of the barriers that happened in the beginning, because the technology used to be so much more expensive to develop and longer to take to market, now we're taking away those pieces. We can just continue to scale more and more. And all of it happens in the same seed. I kind of joke, like everything you want to know in one seed, that's the future, right? And then it replicates into different crops, and the value proposition continue to increase until I suppose we know everything we want about our crops, and that's kind of the limit.
That's amazing. I think one of the things that's super interesting, I had friends, you're starting companies, I got friends that starting companies, and one of our friends on their second company, and they're saying like, and as they're doing it, they're sort of like, well, people always say starting a company is actually hard, but he's actually almost like in a flow state, right? Where he's just like trying things are not working, but very comfortable in that sort of experience. And it sounds like you've done this a couple of times. You've done this with the food brand business. You've done this with a completely different sort of biotech business. What are sort of like, what's the process like? Like, how do you approach that problem of customer discovery, of sort of building a business from scratch multiple times?
For me, one, I actually think there's an advantage to being an outsider, because insiders it's hard for them to see the world different than what it is today. And I see this at every point of time. The writing's on the wall. It's so clear. And it's literally the emperor has no clothes. Everyone's sitting there and no one can say it. So being an outsider means, especially if you have conviction, that you can see the picture as it is and make decisions, but you have to then become an expert. I would say the first couple of years, it was just learning, and I learned a lot, and I talked to a lot of people, because researching online only takes you so far, especially with ag. A lot of the valuable information you're not going to find online. You have to talk to people. It's not written anywhere, right? Because people don't want it to be disseminated. And I think it takes about 2 years to become an expert. And in the meantime, some things you don't need experts for. If you're building deep tech, the science, you need experts, right? So I don't need to become an expert, but my team is heavily weighed into scientists that have a lot of domain expertise, and that's necessary. From the customer journey, I actually think there's two parts to it. Like I am a strategy junkie. So the biggest piece of advice I have for people is know where you're going from day one, right? Like it shouldn't be hard. You need to know where you're going. You need to have a vision of the world 10 years from now, and why it's going to be different and what it's actually going to look like, and then work towards that vision. So at any point in time, it's never difficult for me to figure out where we need to go, because I know where the world is going. And I have one of my mentors says something amazing, which is like, for great founders, the future is so clear that the more risky path is not going there, right? But what you don't want to do is build one thing at a time and say, hey, I'm just going to run this experiment and then see about the next thing. Or, I'll figure out the science and then I'll figure out the go-to-market. Because maybe I'll figure out the science and the go-to-market doesn't work, right? So you want to figure it all out from day one. However, in the middle, things are going to change all the time. So I think the other piece to be comfortable with is we're constantly making decisions without information. In the early days, we would probably do something a year before it was ready. Now it's 6 months before it's ready. So it's getting better. Soon enough, it's going to be 3 months before it's ready, right? But we're always making that decision earlier because biotech takes so long, and field seasons, you only get like 1 a year or 2 if you're doing North America, South America, but you just don't have that many opportunities. What that means is that new information is going to come in and you have to change your mind. And one of the things I've noticed people are uncomfortable with, and that doesn't work well for startups, is because we decided to do something, then we should do it. And then if you change your mind because new information came in, it's like, well, why are you changing your mind all the time? Like, why did we not do that? Honestly, I don't think anyone can lead in a startup without having that intuition around that. Like, you can't answer the question of why things change. Well, they change because there's new information. There's constantly new information, and we have to change. It doesn't mean that the vision changes, but the 3 months change all the time, right? And then that's the iterative process of you're going somewhere, you know where you need to go. You have a strategy to get there, but at the same time, you're running different experiments, changing a lot of things about the business all the time. And there's a comfort level with the team that's okay. It's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. We made a mistake because the world has changed, right?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So many great topics to talk about. I'd love to maybe double click on being an outsider. Just before we started recording, we were talking about outsiders and sort of insiders and how you have this sort of different view. Like, can you kind of expand on that? When you think about the team that you hire and you think about like the team that you hired, how do you think about outsiders and insiders? Like people who can come in and grow, like no one's gonna be perfect for like the role. Like how do you make those decisions on insiders, outsiders, people who are going to be on the growth for sort of domain expertise versus experts?
That's a great question. The early days, there was, again, so when it comes to science, the domain expertise was super critical. The industry expertise, less, right? They happen to all come from ag biotech because that's also the domain expertise. But it's not like they had experience working with the customers. As scientists, usually that's not the case. At InnerPlant, they do actually get a lot of time with the customers, and that's a good thing. But over time, though, we have gone through a transition. So at the early days, it was all about I can hire generalists, and as long as they're passionate and smart and willing to learn, then they're going to figure it out. And the nice thing about it is we were kind of figuring it all out together. Now we're 6 years in. We're commercializing. We've raised our Series B. We're getting to the point where generalists don't fit as much anymore. And honestly, it's both for it slows you down if you're bringing someone that doesn't understand the industry or the domain, or actually both at the same time, I believe at this point. But also it's kind of exhausting to answer the same questions over and over again, right? Like, what's Roundup Ready is a question that an outsider will have to ask and no one in ag will ever ask, right? So I think over time that changes, and we're at the point where we don't want to do that anymore. So when I'm hiring now, I look for both domain and industry expertise. And the idea is like, you got to hit the ground running. Now, the thing that's changed over time is in the beginning, we couldn't bring those people because they would come with that mindset of, well, no, this is not how it works in ag, right? Like no one can ever compete with Monsanto and things like that. And I would constantly have to kind of baby this concept of, yes, we can. Yes, we can. Like the world's changed. It's 30 years since that moment you're thinking about. And now I feel like I don't need to anymore because the narrative is so clear. There's enough, people understand what it is we're doing. There's enough traction that they're joining and they understand that there's an opportunity to do this. And then it's okay for them to be outsiders. There's self-selection, right? They're not going to come here if they don't believe, but when they come in, they have the right experience.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And when you think about that sort of like, when you think about the ag industry, you and I were talking earlier and sort of like, I actually see a lot of parallels to like even tech and semiconductors and other things. And maybe just get your thoughts on ag and the market and all those sort of deep-seated beliefs that you have to kind of talk through for bringing people on board and sort of cultural change and what does it mean when you hire people from ag? What does the ag sort of market and look like these days?
It's a good question. I do wonder if there's a lot of similarities. One of the big differences is, so the average lifespan or the average age of an ag company, a large ag company, is like 130 years old. There hasn't been anything new in a long time. And that's a difficult situation. So the whole industry basically decided that because it's infrastructure, because you have to move physical products around, because the relationships matter and all that, you cannot have a new company. And it's both devastating from like a big company perspective because they believe that they're always going to be on top, right? Because no one can ever compete with them. And at the same time, it's bad for the founders because the founders are coming into it defeated. They kind of like are okay with this narrative that the best you can do is sell for a few $100 million because that's what exists in ag. So I think those are the two challenges that we see. And specifically, it's just maybe the technology decline over time. So those are the beliefs we deal with, right? And that's going to be different depending what you do in agriculture. But when it comes to seed technology, 30 years ago, to make seed technology, when basically Monsanto started, it just took a very long time. So it would take, 8 years to actually do the product development, the discovery, the field trials, and another 10 years to regulate. And nowadays, everything's getting shorter. So it took us less than 3 years to make our product. And the entire industry said there is no way you can do that. And we did it on a fraction of the cost that it cost them. There's various reasons for that. One is we're very focused, right? We don't do discovery of 1,000 things. We do one thing that we wanted to take to market, but also it's just getting cheaper, better, faster to do this kind of technology. Biotech is evolving. But a lot of those beliefs still stand. So everyone in ag is, no, it's going to take you forever. No, like it's going to be too hard. No, regulation is going to be too slow, right? And all these things are just barriers that you keep kind of taking down. And as you do, they start to believe you. But even now, most of them don't believe. Like, I think we're going to have to get to the end game before people will start to open up their minds saying, you know what, maybe, right? Maybe I don't have to question this anymore. And we can just come and look at the science and figure out if we love the concept versus the starting point of, well, what are you going to do about regulatory, which you don't know how many times I have to answer. And there's a lot of ways to answer that. But I think the main answer is it doesn't matter. Like if the product is so revolutionary, then the regulatory process will go through, right? And maybe it takes a little bit longer than you'd like, but there's a business model for that.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I love that sort of disruption. And for me, it's like, look, who would have thought that Intel would lose the semiconductor business to NVIDIA?
I know.
Right? Who would have thought?
It's like a bunch of bad decisions that were made, right? And as they made them, people couldn't see it because they were the winners. And now everyone's kind of uncovering mistakes that were made 20 years ago, driving to this outcome.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sort of like they're kind of, once you get to a certain scale, there's a little bit of like current course and speed, right? Do like annual planning rather than and not paying attention to innovation or market changes. Another one is automotive, right? Like everyone now is suddenly jumping on the electric bandwagon. But I think when we were, decade and a half ago when we were in school, they actually had a case study on why electric vehicles would like never work.
I remember that. Yeah. And I think they still don't work for most, right? They work for Tesla, and the economics are challenging for some others. No, I don't know. Not my domain.
Yeah. Yeah, they work in Palo Alto. I don't know what happens outside. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of disruption going around, and there's a lot of like markets change. I mean, like I'm joking because like there's Europe and there's international where EV is just really picking up. It's not for everything. It's not for heavy industry. But you think about I think about semiconductors and the changes there with leaders and in disruptors. I think about and ag is kind of in that bucket where there's like it sounds like it's a market that is on the same time hard to move, but also kind of ready for disruption. So
some parts of it, yeah. 100%. But it's kind of amazing how people have a hard time seeing that, right? Until it's done. Now, there are parts of it that I don't think will get disrupted ever. And I would say that's like the equipment. So mostly because, again, it's hard to disrupt something that's still growing and where the customers love the brand, and specifically John Deere. That's a much harder proposition than something that's in decline like chemicals. That's kind of the position there. So when I look at startups trying to disrupt the equipment space, like, well, you have a beloved brand with a fully integrated, like best-in-class solution, the dealership network, the support that you need. So I do think it's important to be vigilant and look at the space and be very kind of open with yourself about not just, I love the tech I have, so I'm going to build up a story, but really just like look at the industry and think, is it the right time for what I'm trying to do? Or is it that, again, like maybe I have great tech, but I'm competing with someone that is in a growth mindset, an excellent mindset, and it's going to be really challenging.
Yeah, I think you got this thing we talked about before, just like a strategy junkie. Where did that kind of come from? That sort of foresight, that sort of, that vision, and why is it so natural for you? Like, where did is that from school? Is that from experience? Is that just who you are?
That's a good question. I do think I over strategize in life. So it's a hobby, I suppose, which I think we have in common, knowing you. But there was a moment though. So the previous company, the hummus brand, I had an investor, and I remember he told me, like, I asked him, like, how do we win? And he said, just make the best product. The best product always wins. And I adamantly do not agree with that. I think in tech, in proper tech, 20 years ago, that was the case. But as soon as you get to a point where you have an oligopoly, that's not the case anymore. And I would argue most industries are oligopolies, right? The food industry, not ag as well, but the food industry, there's 5 companies that control like 80% of the supermarket globally. That is an oligopoly. So how do you compete with that? And I didn't have a plan. So I just started to build this thing. We made the best tasting hummus and, did everything on a budget and started selling. And at some point we were at Safeway. And on Safeway shelves, you have Sabra, which is owned by Pepsi. And really, Pepsi built out the hummus industry in the US by buying Sabra. So it wasn't, by chance. They invested in this. And at some point, they had an E. coli outbreak. So their shelves were empty. And they had the best shelf space in supermarkets because they buy it, right? That's how it works. So I would go in, like physically into Safeway stores and move product around from my shelf to their shelf because it was empty. And then I got a call from the buyer saying, you can't do that because they pay us to keep the shelves open. And that was the moment where I understood that strategy matters so much more than product quality, right? Because they're going to have their product there, and who cares that it doesn't taste good? Like consumers tell you all the time, well, but like Sabra is disgusting. Your product tastes great. Sure, but what do you end up buying? You end up buying Sabra or whatever's in front of your face. And that's just how it works, right? So their shelves were empty for a month and a half. And that was the moment I decided I'm done, right? Going into this space, I wouldn't do that mistake anymore. And every industry is probably as consolidated. So you have to think through what's your approach. Like there's so many people working on seed technology like us. And I get founders that reach out to me and they're like, well, the company that's going to buy me is Bayer or Corteva, so I might as well just bring them on board from the beginning. And I'm thinking that's not a strategy. That's like, a child telling you, well, I'll just bring them and then everything's going to work out. And it's like, well, think about it. This is the best part of their business. They want to protect it. They really have no incentive for you to exist. You have to make your point first. If you bring them on board early, the best case outcome for you is they buy you, probably cheap because they have so much influence and inside information. The worst case is they don't buy you. And then no one's going to buy you because you've already brought them on board, right? So even when you do deals, like the right strategy is not everyone all the time and be accessible. The right strategy is choose your partners, bring the people that you want to work with, where you have strategic alliance, and then make that feel like a unique relationship by not selling it to everyone at every point of time, right? And then continue to bring them on board. And we have now various partners, and when we do bring them on board, we go deep, but we do it one at a time, and we build that deep relationship, and we make sure that that company that works with us is going to benefit from that interaction over time. You can't do that if you just open it up to everyone, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. I think it's a great way to sort of very simply think about the strategy behind your business, your two different businesses, and what the dynamics are. I'm kind of curious, are there tools that you would sort of share out with folks that are maybe middle management or even executives that are a little bit more operational and not on the strategy side so much? I'll give you an example is that Mark Leslie, one of our professors, he had this tool called Time Machine. And he said, okay, just picture what's going to happen, like a month, a quarter, a year, 2 years out, and then see what happens. And then you can change your decision and then you can replay it. So he's got this time machine tool that he shared with us.
Is it a tool or is it a method?
Oh, it's an exercise.
Thinking? It's an exercise.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's an exercise, just like think about the future, change the variables, think about the future again, which some people don't do sometimes. Sometimes people are so focused on the next quarter or this fiscal year that they like you try to ask them to time machine out and they just snap back to the quarter and the year.
Yeah, I'm trying to think like that because I'm definitely not a big user of software tools, but mental tools. One of the biggest things that I think, at least at the leadership level, but even middle management in a startup, that I think make people successful is the ability to context shift. And it's kind of like what you're talking about, right? Is sometimes you need to think high level strategy 7 years into the future. And then the next day you need to go in and plant plants in pots, like literally. And you need to know that that is the thing that's going to move the business forward. So I don't really have a tool for that. But what I would say is just not to be afraid of it not feeling like you're doing the same thing all the time. Like you have a way of managing your time. Your time should feel fluid. And then the question is, what does the business need, right? Does the business need for me to just do something right now because it needs to get done? Or does it need for me to take a step back and think into the future or something in the middle, right? Like maybe it's a 3-month planning sprint or whatever it is. But so I think that's just good exercise for people. And then for, again, more for the leadership, but in general, I often joke that my biggest job is to figure out what not to do. So it's, again, maybe a mental exercise, but it's just changing the perception. I think a lot of times CEOs think their job is to figure out what to do, and you can do everything all the time. And your team is going to want you to do so many things. There's no lack of opportunities, right? So you want to surface the next great thing, but really that's happening whether you want it or not at some point, very kind of naturally. Your job is to figure out what not to do. Your job is to be saying no, and not just saying no kind of half-assed, like, don't do this thing. I don't think it's a good idea. They're still maybe going to do the thing, right? Like, it's like, this is not something we do right now. Until I say otherwise, it's not the right time. And being vigilant on the way we use our time and resources is just critical, right? So I would recommend people just spend the time, think about what it is they're trying to do, and then think about what is not the top 3 things that get you there. And if it's not the top 3 things, it's probably not going to get done.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that sort of prioritization and clarity, like 3 things. There's an exec that I knew once that actually got a shirt where he printed his top 3 priorities upside down. And when he was in a meeting and he was in a conversation, he would look down at his shirt and read his priorities. And if it wasn't on the list, he wouldn't do it.
Dorky. Wait, but what happens if he changes? Because that could change.
I didn't really get that far in the conversation. It's good thing I didn't print that shirt. Yeah. The thing that I've actually done it myself is I actually had Zoom backgrounds with priorities on them.
Really?
And
so what were the priorities? Like high level or more detailed?
Oh, like hire and develop the best, right? We had this thing about so you're in post ZERP era, right? Like ZERP era in tech is super hard to hire anybody. You're kind of grabbing for anyone. And what's happened is the talent has really gone up, right? The availability of talent has gone up. So, hire and develop the best has been, okay, we're not trying to jump over the old bar, ZERP era bar. We're trying to jump over a new bar, right? Yeah. And then
so you see, the world has changed, and now you're changing because there's new information, right? That's the.
Yeah, I faced the exact same thing. It's we made a decision over here, and here's the 80 comment thread discussing why we made that decision, and people just can't imagine the fact has changed. Is that's what I face sometimes.
Same. Yeah. And the only way I found to deal with it is to just say I was wrong. I love admitting I'm wrong. Highly recommended to everyone because there's nothing wrong with being wrong. Right. And if the CEO is not able to admit that you're wrong, then no one's going to admit that they're wrong. And the whole, it's interesting. I even started to connect it back to hiring. maybe one of the reasons that people have a hard time firing someone that's not working out, which we all know within 2-3 months, but somehow keep them for a long time, is because you don't want to admit that you're wrong. And think about it, like the hiring process is a very challenging, non-scientific, well-proven not to be great process, right? I don't even know that that is one I would call being wrong. I think it's just a natural part of the process. If you're hiring 10 people, a couple of them are not going to work out. And even when you're doing like A+. So that helps. I just call out being wrong a lot. And then I would say, look, that yes, we made that decision. It was right at the time, but I was wrong, right? In retrospect. And that's fine. So now let's put it behind us. What's the new information? What do we do now?
That's amazing. It's funny because I've been spending some time in Europe and talking to like communities there. And there's this intense, at least I won't name the country, but I think it's multiple. There's an intense fear of being wrong, like an intense fear. And it's very different than sort of like the American culture.
I'm trying to think, what would it be in Europe? Because that's also very prevalent in Asia.
Yeah. I think there's culture about like, and yeah, I think there's a tremendous amount of culture around sort of like not risk taking and being sort of really buttoned up and being accountable when things go wrong, which is important. But also, I think in the US sort of like market, it's sort of like you have a failed company and you get a promotion at your next job, right? That's like the culture.
Yeah, actually, that part I don't love. I'm definitely all about accountability. And I think saying you're wrong is part of being accountable, right? It's not trying to push it downwards. But I don't think being wrong is a problem, right, on its own. And if you can be wrong enough times, then you probably are not going to fail. Failing is a bummer. It's fine. It's all part of the process. But like, I don't think anyone ever failed and at the end of it felt accomplished. So it's like very different than being wrong. Being wrong is part of the journey, whereas failing is the end of the journey. And that is painful.
I teach my kids, either you get what you want or you learn something.
Yeah. I know. I'm like, I don't want to learn anymore. I've learned. I want to succeed.
Well, the other one is learning is what you get when you don't get what you want.
Oh, that's a strong one. But I just feel like you're trolling them.
Well, they'll be stronger.
Like, I just want to get what I want. I don't, but I like that one.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned earlier about sort of like, confidence is something I'd love to double click on, because like, hey, being wrong, like as a CEO, it's okay to be wrong, right? Like, because like, you make mistakes and you can take accountability, and like things that go well, like great, celebrate the team. Things go wrong, hey, it's our fault, the CEO. Like we made that decision, and feel like everyone's got air cover.
100%.
One thing you talked about was like the food brand company. It's like what I thought I heard you say was that, hey, take a little bit of money, make more money, but you didn't have the confidence to do something big. Why was that and what changed?
I honestly think when graduating business school, I was exhausted. Like business school just felt like an insane competition. And I am weirdly, like I'm not a competitive person in the normal sense. I think a lot of people come into an environment like that and they compete with each other and they thrive. I don't compete with other people. I compete with myself. Like I want to be the best that I can be, and there's no end to the ambition, which is mostly insane, but it's also the way my mind works. So being in the environment was not good for me. And when we graduated, I was exhausted, and part of it really impacted my confidence. So I think it was partially that, and maybe I never had high confidence at that point, right? Because I've never really felt like I've done enough to believe in myself. When I started InnerPlant, I don't think I had conviction in myself for a while either. I had this amazing mentor. Was like a communications person, and she constantly would tell me like the fundraising will get better if you have conviction in yourself. But I couldn't have conviction in myself until I had the full plan figured out. Like I needed to know that I've got this, that there's no gaps, that it's solid and it's all about execution. And it took a few years. And I remember the moment, it was probably like early, maybe the end of 21, where I was just like, this is going to happen. Like this is going to be big. It's going to be everything I wanted it to be. And then things really changed. And my confidence went up. And at this point, it's all part of the, what not to do, right? There's a lot of people that want to give you advice and help, and everyone's well-meaning. But in reality, it's like, what are the things that you need? What are the things that are going to move the needle? Who understands the industry really well to be able to support me? And I tend to navigate myself and spend time there because it is value add. So I can be nice about it, but I also am not going to spend time on things that I know are not going to help me. And part of it is having the confidence of saying, I just know what I need and I know what I don't need, right? Whereas in the beginning, it's like a lot of just like, I don't know, like give me advice about everything. I just got to improve, kind of, maybe just being young.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I had the same issues, right? Which is like, I came from Microsoft. I was an engineer, but I was doing a video game business. And I'm like, so like you're building that up. And now I'm doing like critical infrastructure. And I've never done that before. So what do you think it is that gets you? And it sounds like for you, it was getting to that sort of strategic insight and having that sort of full vision and having it buttoned up and that clicked. So is that like the point where you kind of found comfort, or are there other sort of like milestones along the way, or is it just like clicking right there in terms of like full confidence?
I do think it was overarchingly having, I always talk about as InnerPlant putting a 1,000-piece puzzle together, and we're now 2/3 in. But the key is that the puzzle was always there, and it took some time to figure out that the puzzle is there. I didn't want to ever go through 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, and then find out there was a gap that I just didn't understand, and that gap will then kill the business. And with deep tech, you have to do this like insane planning because everything takes so much time. But obviously, alongside that, technical milestones were hit, right? Interestingly enough, though, probably the biggest milestones for us, like making a sensor that we know works well, was probably the end of 23, or maybe middle of 23, doing satellite detection for the first time. This thing that we modeled and believed would work and all that, and so many people didn't think it was going to work, including my co-founder, because he's a molecular biologist and he couldn't figure out how this physics is actually going to play out. We did for the first time at the end of 23. Some of the bigger partnerships that we did, 22, 23. So my conviction came before all of those proof points, right? But the proof points definitely validate, and you want to continue to have those wins because otherwise it's a very exhausting journey. And at this point, I think my internal clock is I need a win every 3 months or things get pretty exhausting. Like it's so much easier if you have that inflow of good news and you can share it with the team, and then you can be the cheerleader the rest of the time. Whereas if you wait a very long time, or even worse, if you have negative momentum, I'm assuming that's super exhausting, and I don't want to get into it if I don't need to.
That's like, it is just crazy, the technical, like the deep tech work you have to do. So you got to get the plant to work biologically. And then can you just say a little bit more about like, okay, you've got plants that are now able to emit, is it infrared fluorescent colors that are seeable from space? And how does that work?
So what we do is we tap into the plant's immune system reaction. So that's when the plants, for example, are infected by fungus, which is key, because if you have spores out there, there's always spores. But you only get an infection if you have the right conditions, which is there's spores present, there's the right weather conditions, and there's a potential host that's ready to be infected. That's the plant. So if the plant is really healthy, it's still not get infected, depending on the situation. When the infection starts, the plant starts to activate genes in order to like literally shut down those leaves and protect itself from the fungus spreading. That's what we tap into. And then we add a line of code. So as it's doing that, it's going to start producing a fluorescent protein. The first one is green. So they're all in the visible spectrum. And the reason is plants naturally fluoresce in the infrared. So that to us is noise because it doesn't mean anything. It means the plant's generally stressed. So we avoid that. And we use the visible spectra. So then we have green, fungus, soybean. From there, it's really about leveraging satellite imagery, hyperspectral, multispectral, and then algorithms in order to decipher that signal. And what's cool about the system we use is we use the sun as the excitation light. And that was really the part that no one thought made sense, because fluorescence is a light activated by light. So for scientists, that always means you use a laser, you use a light source, and you filter some of the light and you see the signal. And that's how you do it in a lab or controlled environment or the field even. But with satellites, obviously, you can't add a light source. So that was key, that the sun is the one activating the signal. And then there's algorithms to clean it out. From there, it goes into modeling, because you want to build predictive models around this, right? So the next step is, okay, there's a signal coming up, there's fungal pressure in this area of the field. Let's ingest as much data as we can to figure out what to do next, right? So historical data, soil conditions, environmental data, weather, humidity, temperature, so on. And then you basically make the recommendation, you should go out to the field, you should do something. Or do nothing, because maybe it's not going to continue to get bad, or really like it's going to rain tomorrow and there's no point to put a product out there, right? So it depends on the conditions. And then that's kind of the last part of this, is it goes to either through a software system or through an agronomist, and making the recommendation, the right product, go out to the field, you apply the remedy. And that's the full circle.
That's amazing.
We have 3 different scientists. We have biotech, we have detection, remote sensing, and then we have software.
How do you get the satellite type? Is there like a website? Is that like on eBay? Like how do you rent a satellite? Can I take some pictures of how does it work? Yeah.
That's a good question. You can task satellites, but I think you probably need a company and a good reason, because I don't know if you just look at your house. But yeah, that's how it works. Like we work with a lot of government-based satellites. So then you literally like get in touch with them, and then you task them and you ask them to cover your field, and they'll collect the imagery. And then there's relationships with commercial companies like Planet. So Planet has a whole constellation, and they do what would be better fit for a commercial full-scale application versus like smaller locations right now. And then who knows, if we really get to like a wild future, we might run our own constellation. But there's really no need unless there's some kind of additional value that we can generate that would make that valuable. I don't know. It's hard to say that will ever be the need.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Like your business model is actually enabled by sort of like available satellite, infrastructure, right? So it's like, hey, just the way that like AWS made computers and data centers like fractional, you actually have like tasking satellites, right? You have a fractional business and able to do that. Are there like what has been the impact of like for your business? It's opened it up. Like what's been the impact of sort of like satellite and access to space becoming more democratized and becoming fractional? Like what other industries do you see are opening up, and how did you sort of like discover this?
So by the way, it's not just the satellites. I now we talk about this, that there's so many technologies that had to be developed in order for InnerPlant to do what we do. Right. And the bet in the early days was we'll get there. And we actually had a lot of investors being like, well, are there going to be that many satellites? And it's like, well, it seems like it, right? They're getting better. But it was a ton of investment that happened. So satellites is one, right? Because obviously you don't want to be running constellations of satellites, but now it's so freaking cheap. It's crazy to me. Like it costs like thousands of dollars per kilo to launch a satellite. Like you can literally like have a project and go fund me and launch a satellite. Now, obviously constellation is very different. You need to run it, but, and then there's all the software infrastructure, like basically the field connectivity, cloud computing, edge computing, all of that was necessary. The equipment getting smarter. So having these capabilities to collect the data and then also validate it and close the ROI, circling the field, all of that was not there before. And then there's also the farm software management systems. There's a lot of investment that went in through VC into platforms that ended up failing as commercial entities, but they were then bought by the industry and used as the front end, the kind of the operation systems for ag. Without that, it would have been so much harder because every platform like this costs $1 billion to operate or to build and run. And for us, we're just, okay, we can feed our data or become an application. That costs almost nothing now. If all these, and then there's like a ton of stuff that happened on the biotech. If all those things would not have happened, we couldn't do this because every one of these would make it just too expensive to continue to develop for the full solution. So I don't know. I would say about satellite specifically, I don't think there's a lot of good applications for ag. Because I don't think there's anything you can look at plants and see that's super valuable. For us, we're basically engineering the earth to be visible, right? So we know what the signal is. We don't need to look for a needle in the haystack. We just look for the signal and then we know what it means. And I do think that can open up a lot of opportunities to make it valuable for ag. But what I see a lot of good decisions made in satellite businesses is going into oil and gas and places where like methane detections, right? People think about methane leaks or oil leaks or whatever. I don't actually know the terminology as like climate, but it's really that the companies that sell oil and gas don't want to have leaks. So there's actually a value proposition for them and the climate impact. And that's always necessary.
Yeah, that's amazing. So maybe just one last question out of curiosity, because like I end up like traveling a lot internationally and actually talking to like different sort of governments and even schools, like business schools. And what they always ask about is like the concentration of innovation in Silicon Valley, right? That's kind of been around Stanford. So if you're thinking about like, how do you make more Shelleys out there, right? Like you just have an outsider background. You're like, okay, we've got lots of outsiders and sort of coming in to disrupt like an agricultural business. Like what patterns do you see about yourself or your classmates or the Valley that you think, and I don't know if you get this question when you travel, it's like, hey, how do we get more Silicon Valleys in the world? Or how do we get more sort of like disruptive education in business schools?
That's a tough question. I mean, I think the issue is none of us grew up here, right? We came here for a reason. So to create that environment, you have to create basically a thriving business opportunity that attracts people. And I think the US has it. It's not just the Silicon Valley, it's the market. Right. So if you go, I don't know, you go to France, you have all of the issues around hiring and the social structures that are not super easy to navigate at a startup. And then where's the market opportunity? Because if it happens to be somewhere else, then you have to go there anyways. Or like Israel is a good example because people have to ask me about Israel. And Israel is a great place to incubate. But the problem is it's so freaking far away from everything. You're going to end up here anyways. And if you're going to end up here, you might as well go there. So for me, it's really about the market. And then the infrastructure that this place has, the Silicon Valley, is novel. There is just so much talent and so much capital. I don't know if this is your experience too, but it's kind of funny when traveling somewhere and people are like, well, do you want to meet investors? Dubai, I was in COP last year and I'm looking up investors and literally everyone has an office in the Valley. Like all the sovereign wealth funds have an office in the Valley. It's like, there's really not a lot of places to go to actually find capital that doesn't exist here. That is an advantage, right? It makes it a lot easier. But it's hard. You have to get all those pieces together. You have to have capital, you have to have the right mindset, you have to have talent available, and then you have to have a market opportunity. Otherwise, you're like traveling constantly to get to your customers, which is also difficult.
Yeah, there's a lot of like geographical, like size of market advantages, plus sort of like structural advantages. So, all right, maybe we'll keep at it and try to help our friends.
Yeah, maybe it's Silicon Valley. Until it's not, it's great, right? And when is it not? It will happen. Things will shift. It's just, it might take more time than we have, is kind of where I'm at.
Totally with you. Shely, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything we can guide people to in terms of like social media or websites? I think you have a podcast, like where to find out more about you and InnerPlant.
Absolutely. We have, first of all, our website is InnerPlant.com, and then we have social media, I think LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter and wherever farmers are as well. And yeah, we do have a podcast. So the podcast you can find on the website, and it's all about the future of agriculture. So maybe a lot more niche, but it's been a great experience to host that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shely. Thanks so much for listening. If you like this content, please join our LinkedIn group. Please thumbs up, please comment, please subscribe. We'd love to bring more of this content to you.